Supreme Court rules Catholic group doesn't have to consider LGBTQ foster parents in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. On June 17th, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled in favor of Catholic Social Services, a conservative adoption agency based in Philadelphia, in a landmark case regarding the separation of church and state. The court ruled in a 9-0 verdict, that is a unanimous verdict, that the Catholic organization is entitled to screen potential foster parents and refuse to work with LGBTQ parents seeking to adopt, even though Philadelphia law prohibits such discrimination. The city of Philadelphia had sought to end its contract with Catholic Social Services due to this blatant discrimination. When the CSS's policy was made public, the city terminated its contract with CSS for adoption and foster services. CSS then filed a suit arguing that the city's position violated its constitutional right to freedom of religion.
So what is a... Okay, Rivka, go ahead.
I actually have quite a bit about this because I had a very long conversation with a friend of mine who's an attorney in DC, who also happens to, and so I know a lot about this. And people,
all right. So Rivka, can we do a short version analysis of this before we do a deep dive? Like, what is the overall reasoning behind this?
Well, that's what I'm trying to tell you.
Okay.
This is exactly what it is. So the reason the court, according to what we can glean from the decision, which he and I both read, that the court found that for the church is based in really a very, very narrow sense. Because the city of Philadelphia offers exceptions to their standards, their rules, at the discretion of the local or the city or the state authority, the city authorities, but refused to grant the Catholic Church that an exception. That is what this ruling is about. If you're going to give it some exceptions to their standards and their statutes to some groups, but then refuse those exceptions to others, that is a violation of the, equal protection in the sense of, or not equal protection, but it's a violation of this equality and their rights. Because why don't they get exceptions? Some people get exceptions. How come we can't get an exception? Is it because you don't like us? You're discriminating against us? So that's exactly what the ruling was about. So the way to solve the problem is not to rage that the Catholic Church is discriminating, because they are, and that's wrong, but is to remove the exception. So when you remove the exception, then you remove the source of the problem. So
what is this other good that got the exception?
I'm not sure. I don't remember. My friend told me, but he said it's the law permits arbitrary government discrimination exercised here based on Catholic social services by allowing exceptions to be made to its otherwise express requirements of non-discrimination by contractors. So in other words, government can't discriminate. You can't discriminate against the same-sex couple and then in the same breath provide an exception to that rule to be granted at the government's discretion without, by necessity, violating the rights of the person who isn't granted the exception. So that's the whole point. Yes, we can talk about how it's bad that they are able to discriminate and that they can, from what I understand, receive, state and federal funds because they are a major foster and adoptive care provider, social service provider in this area. Major. But lots of other religious groups have been granted the right to discriminate based on their religion. But if you're not receiving government funds, then the government doesn't have any control in saying, yes, you can do this or no, you can't. But when you're granting exceptions and not to others, that's the problem.
Okay, but my question is like, wouldn't the, I mean, what if the original discrimination was also unconstitutional? Wouldn't the court be able to say like, oh yeah, you don't get an exception, and the previous ruling was also a mistake? Like they have the power to say, yeah, that was like the fact that some other people got an exception. We are undoing the harm of that by not giving you the exception. We're like making a new precedent. Like they don't have to stick to whatever was done before. Can they be
No,
like, yeah, that was a
because
mistake?
no,
Yeah.
because in the United States, even in every municipality, state, federal, there's separation of powers. The court doesn't make law, it only enforces or interprets. Or
I
not
understand that.
enforces, but it interprets. The law, to undo those things, you have to go to legislature and say,
Yeah, I understand
this
that. That's
was
not what.
wrong based on the court's finding for that. So we have to change this so it doesn't happen again.
Yes, Rivka, I understand that part. I didn't say that they should make a new rule. They should make a new law. What I'm suggesting is that the interpretation of the already existing law, they could have argued that the interpretation of the existing law was wrong when it comes to that exception provided to that other group, right? And I don't know, like, if it's the case
Perhaps,
here.
but they
Yeah.
don't argue. They just listen and decide. The argument is for the city of Philadelphia. The person argues for the attorney for the city of Philadelphia or for the Catholic Church. So arguments that were made, you know, the Catholic Church's lawyers want you to interpret it as a win for freedom of religion and they get to do whatever because it's their religion. But really, that's not what it's about. It's about a technicality. It's a narrow issue. You can't do one thing for one group and not do it for the other.
I
The
know,
way to
so
solve it is get rid of
mentioned that.
the except.
You mentioned that part already. So here's one thing that you mentioned. Okay, so here's another thing. Let's move on for this because I think you could go on forever. Because I don't what I don't understand is that in the United States we have anti-discrimination laws, right? When we say religious organization have an exemption, like we don't actually. That is not the case. Like for example, if a church. Again, I'm not saying this is how it is because obviously Rivka knows a lot more about the US than me. So maybe you could clarify this. But if a church doesn't want to deny Black people, okay, into its building, that would be against the laws of United States, and that would not be allowed. And there would be there's no religious exemption for that, right? So the anti-discrimination laws that exist within the United States, there is no religious freedom argument within the Constitution that could make the churches not abide by that, right? So if that is the standard that we have, like, you know, if no church can say like, oh yeah, we don't allow Black people here, and that would be like, they would be, I mean, at least the public version of ones, right? Then why can't that be applied here as well? And if there was any exemptions that was given to any religious institutions before, the court doesn't have to invent the law. They could come and say like, yeah, that was a wrong interpretation of the law. Here's now the correct interpretation of the law. We're setting a new precedent, not by introducing a law. We're setting a new precedent by coming up with the correct interpretation of the laws that already exist. So that's what I'm asking. I have another question, but Susanna, I see. Both Susanna and Rivka. Susanna, you go, and then Rivka.
Well, I just wanted to talk about how, so I was watching the Freedom from Religion Foundation actually did like an hour-and-a-half long video about this a few days ago with their one of the directors of their legal affairs, Andrew Seidel. And FFRF actually submitted an amicus brief to this case as well. So they were involved with the proceedings, but they were talking about a lot of different aspects of this case. So if you want like a really detailed analysis, I really recommend you guys go watch that, especially from a secular perspective. But they were talking about how the court could provide no explanation about how discrimination in this variety is any different from racial discrimination. They're like, what? There's nothing that is like separates the two. So if the I don't know. I got confused by some of the details of this case, but to me, I'm like, does that mean if this happened in a racial context, like that'd be fine? That's what confuses me so much. And it sounded to me like the experts at FFRF are saying like they're not making any distinguishing difference because they can't. They don't have an argument.
Me with all my ignorance of U.S. laws, were just made the same argument that that's a legal expert Andrew Seidel from Freedom from Religion Foundation made. Like, okay, I just wanted to take credit for being able to make that argument. Good. Wow, I don't even need a legal degree, and I'm making the same argument. Isn't that impressive, Rivka?
So, couple things. We did a story about a church in Minnesota, I believe, that was a whites-only church. And I don't remember what the outcome is, but they're not providing a service, I don't like, to the entire population the way that people are forced into child services, right? Through the courts or through an emergency. So there's that. Then also, yes, you may not be able to actually make a distinction between discrimination based on someone's sexuality or sexual preference and racial discrimination, but that's not what the ruling was on. So that's what's really important to understand. Most constitutional cases that talk about things that are unconstitutional aren't won on the Constitution. They're won or lost on technicalities or on little narrow things. So the point is, yes, they're saying it's discriminatory, not because they have an okay type of discrimination, but they've been discriminated against because some people who may also have an equally abhorrent type of discrimination have been given an exception. These people haven't. And that's what makes it the problem for the court in this case. Now, the lawyers for the church want you to believe that it's all about their right to have whatever belief that they want and then act on it. And doesn't matter whether it's against the rules
Rivka,
or they get money.
It's their right to be paid by the state and discriminate while doing
That's what
so.
I was about to say.
This is what the point of this case is. Is their right to have a contract with the state and still discriminate.
Exactly. So which has been the standard in the past, to Armin's point, that if you take state money, you have to, or federal money or whatever, you have to abide by these sets of rules. Well, good. Then it's got to be equal across the board, that no one gets an exception or everyone gets an exception. And if everyone gets an exception, what's the point of having the rule? The law that you can't discriminate. So that's where it has to change. And in order to change it or argue something different, that on appeal, they could argue different things. If it's appealed by the city or if it's appealed, Philadelphia, the Catholic Church not going to appeal it because they won.
All right.
But the court's telling them how to fix the problem. So this doesn't happen again.
My turn. So just to point out that the difference between that all-white church, all-white church that we mentioned is that all-white church that managed to get away from the law was by acting like they're not providing a public service and making it a private club, right? So even if an organization or a company or an institution is not getting funding from the government, if they're providing a service to the public, they will still anti-discrimination laws will still be applied to them. I mean, the fact that these are getting government funding, that makes it even more problematic. But I think like any like even a private institution that's providing a service to the public, if they say like we don't accept, I don't know, black people over here or anything like that, it would be legal based on anti-discrimination laws, right? I'm assuming that's how it works in the United States, right? So my question is, do you think that this case would have gotten a different treatment from the Supreme Court of the United States if it had said, if the case was the Supreme Court rules Catholic group doesn't have to consider black parents, right? Do you think they would come out with the same result if instead of LGBT, it was black? And if the results would have been different, why would it be different? Like, why is there a difference?
I think they would have actually come up with the same result if the situation were the same, because they weren't ruling on the discrimination that the church was engaged in. They were ruling on the discrimination that the government and of Philadelphia was engaged in, which was giving some people exceptions and others not. And so this is why sometimes you see these rulings that people think are absolutely outrageous and wrong, because the law is saying, according to the court, if you grant exceptions to one, you have to grant exceptions to all. And so,
okay, guys, the things that we mentioned before, let's try not to repeat the things that we already mentioned before. Suze,
I have to explain the point that you're making. It's not about the discrimination the church is engaging in.
That's why I said let's try. Even if we have to, we have to. But let's try, because sometimes we like this the same sentence. Now we have said it like more than 10 times. Suze, you had your hands up.
Oh, well, I just wanted to say, to Rivka's point, that's actually exactly why this was a unanimous decision, and we got, our more liberal judges to render this decision in a way that other people may have been surprised by, for exactly the reasons that Rivka was describing. And it's kind of interesting in terms of how the decision goes. There was like a majority opinion, and then there were different takes on how the three other takes on how different judges reached the same conclusion. Some of them had arguments that the FFRF described as more evil. So if you were going with the most evil argument of this decision, you go with, according to them, what Justice Alito argued. The Roberts argument was a little bit less evil, according to them. I didn't read the opinions. But yeah, this was a very interesting case. It's going to have to go back to like contractual stuff and the city legislature to actually remove this exception. And then the contract negotiations with the Catholic Social Services will be on a very different footing. It's pretty interesting too, because this was all revolving around Catholic Social Services being contracted to do one specific service, which was actually picking who gets approved to be like an accredited foster parent, right? And they were denying home visits to same-sex parents, and they were denying them this accreditation. So the city decided to not renew or like their contract with them over those services. But this social services agency was actually still being contracted and paid by the city for doing other services, just not the service in which they were discriminating against people. Even then, because of this exception, well, we know how it went.
If Rivka is correct, which she usually is, then it's so bizarre to me that in the United States right now, you're saying if the LGBT was black, based on the reasoning that Rivka gave us, we would have gotten the same result. So we're saying that the United States is a country that a religious group would be allowed not to provide services to black people if they wanted to, and still get government funding while doing that. That's the country that United States is right now?
No, you're not understanding. That's why I keep repeating myself. That is not what we're saying. We're simply ruling is on one aspect of the law. That's what they sued on. Why do we not get an exception and other people do? Not about the discrimination that they were engaged in. The court is, some people like Alito and others were making that argument, saying that they should be able to discriminate because God and blah, blah, blah. But that's not what the ruling was about. The ruling was simply about the law and
I
whether.
understand that. I completely understand that, Rivka. You mentioned Oh my
It's not
God.
saying that you're
So-
allowed to discriminate. It's saying the government has to do something a certain way.
Okay, so you actually
And these
didn't need to
people
repeat that.
won.
Okay, Rivka, please, Rivka. I already understood that part because this is something that I heard before. I knew that part, so it wasn't actually needed to be repeated. Because what I'm saying is that I understand what the argument is. But I'm talking about the final effect of it. All right, I'm not saying the government is saying like, oh, you're allowed to discriminate against LGBT and Black people, right? So I'm saying through these legal arguments, what we're getting, what the end result is, as we're speaking right now, okay, even though the arguments for it is based on some technicalities, because the ruling was not based on, oh yeah, you're allowed to discriminate. I understand that that's not the ruling, but the net effect, the final conclusion, the result of this is, the practical conclusion of this is that religious organization is getting away with discriminating based on somebody being LGBT and still get government funding. That is the final result. So yes, United States right now is a country that there are institutions that exist within it that could openly discriminate based on people's biological, in characteristics, and not only be allowed to do that, not only be it legal for them to do that, on top of that, get funded by the government while it's doing that. So that's what I'm trying to say. And again, that's not my explanation was wrong, so I'm not blaming this on Rivka. Like maybe I didn't explain what I was saying so properly. So the reason why I didn't explain it well, because I had to add the net effect, the final results of it is, right? So not that you're right, Rivka, you explained this to me already. The way I explained it, maybe it suggested that I'm saying that the court is saying that. It's not saying that, but that's the result. Suze, you have your hand up?
Well, the result in these very specific instances of contract exceptions.
Yes, so this doesn't set a precedent.
For religious reasons.
Yeah, yeah, okay. Does this set a precedent, though?
I think I'm no expert. Yes, it's a Supreme Court case.
If you get a case where you have the same thing happen in another city with another group, whether they're religious or not, but then it could, because they could say, in this case, you gave one to other. But again, you can solve that problem in the future forever and never have it come up if you get rid of the way the contract awarding exceptions are written into statute.
And you think the solution to that is not through the Supreme Court, but by changing the law?
In Philadelphia, yeah, because if they get rid of it and then they have to negotiate and there's no exceptions for anybody, then the Catholic Church can't say you're discriminating against us. You either play ball with us or hit the street.
Okay, so don't.
You know what? One more thing, and this brings up a very important point, because when you allow religious groups to do functions like they're doing, but still get government money, if they decide, okay, we don't want to play ball, we don't want to follow the rules to get the money and to provide the service, we're going to leave and not provide the service, then oftentimes the communities that receive the services are the ones that suffer, because the safety nets and the infrastructure and the social service agencies within a community, a state, a municipality are not sufficient without depending upon the religious institutions to do some of the work that needs to be done. And so if the Catholics decide to leave, and these are cases that have actually happened, also mostly about adoption in other places where the rule, like, look, you can't discriminate, and they're like, okay, well then we won't do adoption placements. And then the community is left with this massive gaping hole because they don't have a service provider, and all kinds of children suffer as a result.
So maybe take away their, like, maybe another part of the solution is to take their competitive advantage away by starting to build alternatives. Is that what you suggest? Me? Right.
Building
Mhm.
Okay, that-
alternatives
Solution.
and funding the state alternatives properly, giving more money to that aspect of the government.
Okay, that last point was really
Fire.
something key. Yeah, no, that was key. I'm glad that you brought that up because I
Hey guys, if you're a fan of Blasphemy and Sexy Callie, you know, like me, then you need to be sure to subscribe to our newsletter, link in the description below. Because if you subscribe, we will send you a free copy of our Blasphemous Art ebook. And let me tell you, it is the tastiest blasphemy that you can find anywhere available today. And we are so generous with our blasphemy that we continue to send you more blasphemy every week. So make sure to subscribe, link in the description below.